This is the Personal Foul Podcast. I have a special guest coming on this week, former Rowan prof, just like myself, John Sadak from CBS. He's a play-by-play guy in Westwood 1. John, I know I've been reaching out to you. I really appreciate you coming on this week.
You got it. Glad to be here, bud.
So I know we have that Rowan connection. So what's it like seeing where Rowan's going? I know Rowan's growing a little bit as a university right now. And what do you like about the changes that are going on here?
I love all of it. I mean, I love Rowan. It's truly a beloved piece of my person. A lot of everything that I am, even beyond the job field, stems from there. A lot of my lifetime friends have come from there, including the Rowan radio station manager, Derek Jones. We worked together as undergraduates. We were in grad school together. We both covered Princeton sports together for a number of years. I love everything about Rowan. And I do love the sport communication program that Dr. John Giannini, who I never met as a student, he had left just before I arrived when they had won the national title. But the first men's basketball game that I ever covered on national television was a Villanova-LaSalle game. And it was the first chance I had to meet Dr. G. And we have since become friends, and we talk and text. And when he first got the job there, I'd reached out quite a bit. But the growth is great to see. It's becoming a truly comprehensive, fully faceted, worldwide recognized university.
It is, and they did just add the sports program, the sports communication program in. And John actually got promoted to the athletic director, and Neil Hartman is now working with the sports area in the field.
Yep. Yeah. I'm aware after Dan Gilmore was done as the AD, and Dr. G now is the interim AD, and hopefully that sticks, because I think he could bring about a lot of good and positive change for athletics to continue to grow.
So where can people find you, John? Where can people get in touch with you, give you a follow, and hear all the information that you bring to the Twitter world and, just sports in general?
Well, on Twitter, I'm at John Sadak, my full name, all one word, JOHN SADAK, and I'm on Instagram as john.sadak. And generally I use those platforms more as promotional vehicles for the games that I'm on, and trying to give some tidbits and heads up for the broadcast that'll work.
You can follow the Personal Foul Podcast on Twitter at @foul_podcast. You can find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, we're on there. But let's get right into it, John. I know you cover a lot of college football, and, man, we have a crazy year this year in the top 25. And to start off, LSU at number 1. I think LSU is the best team in college football right now. I don't know what your take is on LSU. I think LSU is the best right now in college football.
I would agree. I think LSU has, for years, really since the advent of the BCS in particular, and what's spilled into what's now the CFP, they've always been in that conversation, and it seemed like the biggest lacking element was consistent quarterback play and everything that spills offensively from that. And that's what Joe Burrow has changed around dramatically. Joe Burrow is a fantastic talent. He's one of the great stories in sport, from walk-on at Ohio State to stud star at LSU. We actually had the chance almost exactly a year ago. It was Black Friday last football season. I worked a MAC game in Athens, Ohio, the Ohio Bobcats, and his dad was a coordinator on that staff. And during our call, when we asked him about his son, he let us know that he was planning on stepping away from his lifetime of coaching to watch his boy, he believed, blossom into a national star. And when you hear that, you think, wow, well, good for him. You hope he has a lot of success. He certainly has some pedigree to him. And what he's achieved has just been out of this world. And he showed it against Alabama. The difference in that game as it became a shootout was Joe Burrow responded every single time in directing that offense.
It felt like every single time Burrow had the ball in that game against Bama. And the thing is, it was at Alabama. It wasn't a home game for LSU. They were on the road and beat Nick Saban, who doesn't lose at home. And as you did say, he went right down the field. It felt like every single time answering. Every time Alabama crept back into the game, here's Joe Burrow lighting another flame for LSU. And as you touched on, LSU has been missing the offensive piece all these years, and they finally got their quarterback in Joe Burrow, and that offense is stout.
Yeah, and I think they're the top team in college football right now. So it's up to LSU to seal things. Winning the SEC is not easy, and it's not a given. But I think they have all the weaponry to be able to accomplish it.
Then you have Ohio State at number 2. Ohio State has something to say about that number 1 spot. And I think this is one of the best Ohio State teams we've seen in a few years now, and figure they're without their key piece on defense, and the offense is just great. I mean, Justin Fields transferring in and J.K. Dobbins in the backfield. That offense is legit, and Ohio State's got some tasks coming up here in the next few weeks. They got Penn State this weekend, and then they have Michigan at Michigan the following weekend. What's your take on Ohio State, and can they slide into that number 1 spot with LSU not really playing any top teams like Ohio State is in the next few weeks?
I think it's possible. I do think the committee has shown a willingness, certainly with how they propelled Minnesota during the course of the CFP rankings unveils, that week to week it's mutable. It can change to some extent. And the Penn State game is a great test. I think, though, LSU more than likely is going to own that number 1 spot until it were to lose. If it did lose, that could change. But until that point, I would be surprised if LSU dropped. Now, that said, yeah, Ohio State comes out and truly bludgeons Penn State. I think it's possible. I don't think it really matters. I think as long as you're in that top 4 and you make the CFP, I think that's what has the greatest significance. But, yeah, this Ohio State team is incredibly complete. I think a lot of people would love to see an Ohio State LSU game. I mean, the narrative, the story of Burrow defecting from Ohio State and going to LSU, that would be a remarkable, incredibly fun drama to unfold. Athens, Ohio, in the shadows of Columbus, has basically become an LSU town because of Joe Burrow. But they're truly dynamic. I do think, while flawed, Michigan is its own unique test. I've had the chance to work the game a handful of times on national radio for Westwood 1, and there is some energy and sizzle to that game that it's one of those cliche rivalry matchups where previous results don't necessarily carry in or spill in. It is a game truly unto itself. And I think this Penn State team has a lot of talent. They're outgunned against Ohio State, but while they're significant underdogs in that game, a Penn State victory would not stun. It would surprise, but it wouldn't have that level of total shock.
Yeah, I think Penn State, as you did touch on with Minnesota hopping all the way up after that win, and Minnesota coming back down to earth this week after Iowa took it to them. It definitely is interesting with Ohio State with the next few games they have coming up. I think Ohio State has looked fantastic this year, as we touched on so far. And Penn State, I'm not really sold on Penn State. I mean, you saw Michigan almost beat them on the road at Happy Valley in a night game in a whiteout, which you feel like Penn State doesn't lose any of those. Michigan hung around, and Michigan was down early in that game. And it looked like, here we go. Here's another hardball game where they get blown out against the top team. And Shea Patterson, who's struggled all year, especially early on, fumbling the football, turning the ball over, has seemed to figure it out in a way where he's not necessarily winning the game, but not hurting the team and not turning the ball over, and is able to move the ball right now with the legit wideouts on the outside with Nico Collins, Tariq Black, Donovan Peoples-Jones. And it's, could they give Ohio State a test at home?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think because it can be a classic look-ahead moment. You got Michigan the very next week. Probably part of what will angle things a little bit for them. If I'm selling the game to that team, it's you were slighted in the CFP poll. So let's go out and really make an underscored statement. But I think Penn State has been a team that's played a little bit to its opponent. I think we've seen that with Pitt in recent years as well. They don't have nearly the same level of depth that an Ohio State, LSU, Alabama, or Clemson have. So if that first unit is not performing up to its normal standard and capability, that second unit drops off a little bit more dramatically than those teams do. But they're huge underdogs for a reason. I mean, Ohio State is in that conversation to be the number 1, and they are the number 2 as it stands right now. But it's a conference game, and I think James Franklin is an incredible salesman in recruiting, and I think he's a very strong motivator for that team when they have opportunities like this.
I think it is a big opportunity for them to try to make a statement here against Ohio State. And Clifford, I feel like struggled a little bit the past few weeks. He did what he had to do here against Indiana this past week, and Indiana is a very underrated football team, almost beating Penn State on the road. Again, another home game for Penn State. They almost lost. And you can't forget K.J. Dobbins there on the outside for them. And Hamler, excuse me, not Dobbins. I'm talking Ohio State. It's just very interesting. Penn State is known for that front this year, and I think you've seen some teams, especially Minnesota, putting up some points. I get Minnesota was at home. Minnesota put some points up on them. Indiana put some points up on them this week, and you got the very, very talented Ohio State offense coming into town. It is a very, very big task for Penn State, especially going on the road to Ohio State.
Yeah, totally agree.
So then going into the rest of the list, we have Clemson at number 3, who's starting to figure it out, it looks like. Trevor Lawrence starting to play some better football. Struggled early on. You almost had them lose to North Carolina in that walk-off game. And Clemson's starting to figure it out. Lawrence was turning the ball over early on in the season as well, just like Shea Patterson. But Lawrence is starting to figure it out now, not turning the ball over the past few contests. What do you think about Clemson starting to creep back in there at 11-0?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's kind of surprising to see them creeping back in, right? I mean, this is the dominant program in the last couple of years of college football. And the ACC doesn't have the same level of national competition shoulder to shoulder with Clemson at the top of the league. But I do think the league is underrated nationally. I think there's more talent in the middle than people give it credit for. But this Clemson team is basically that same level of talent, capability, and pedigree. And traditionally, yes, every season is kind of unto itself. But we've seen the dynastic carry that Alabama has earned over the course of the years, right? I think this Alabama team has now shown that defensively they are a notch below what a lot of the previous iterations of Nick Saban's team have been. And with the loss of Tua, that could mean an even more dramatic change for a team that once Lane Kiffin came on as the OC, straddling that McElwain and the Kiffin era. They became a team that started outscoring squads that could hide some of their defensive mistakes by outscoring teams that's not quite as successful in more recent years. And yet Clemson has had a very similar stretch of ultra dominance, and yet it feels like that spillover factor isn't being given that same level of respect. I understand it. I get it. But I think it's another tremendous motivational tool. And to be honest, they should not be challenged through the rest of the way in the ACC. And I could easily see a scenario where if there are slips in front of them, that they could wind up being the number 1 team by the time the actual semifinals get set.
Yeah, they really could be the number 1 team by the time everything is said and done, after the conference championships are played out. And it's just crazy to think, as you touched on early on with the Clemson struggles, here we are. They could be the number 1 team by the time this playoff gets started. Then we have the next team up, and it's Georgia. Jake Fromm, 3 touchdowns this week against Auburn. I'm not 100% sold on Georgia, especially seeing Georgia in the past in the national playoff and getting dismantled and just not showing up. I'm not really sold on Georgia getting a shot again, but the way it's looking right now, they very well might get that chance. What do you like from Jake Fromm and DeAndre Swift in Georgia?
Well, they have tremendous team speed. I think when you watch them week to week, the amount of team speed they have on both sides of the ball is what jumps out the most. And I think speed is one of those erasers that can clear up a ton of mistakes. Fromm has been a gritty playmaker. Blankenship is one of the most clutch kickers that college football has had. I think if you win the SEC, which is incredibly possible for this Georgia team, all things are possible. Georgia has shown that on the national stage in recent years as well. I think the linebackers in particular are very tough matchups. For a lot of teams, they're incredibly versatile thanks to the combination of power and speed that they have. And I think as long as Fromm has the ball in his hand, they will have a chance with almost any deficit, provided they have the time. They're a team that can score a ton of points in a hurry. They're super deep at running back, which is what they're most known for historically, and I think this team is no exception in that regard. And I think the SEC East in general gets grossly outshadowed and underrated because the West deserves the accolades that they get. It's the best division in major college football. But I think the East has kind of been viewed as an also-ran. And what Georgia's become in the last few years, this isn't the East that Florida won with defense and scoring 20-something points a game, or that Mizzou was able to win, but with underwhelming teams that had a handful of stars that were exposed when they faced the might of the West in the SEC championship game. This is a Georgia team that can win the SEC, and if they do that, they're in the CFP. If they win the SEC title game, I don't see how you can deny them.
Yeah, I don't think you can deny them if they somehow win the conference. Then you have Alabama sitting there at number 5. I think everyone knows about the Tua injury. He had successful surgery, but the season is done for Tua. It's crazy to think a guy like that, the talent of Tua, not being with Alabama, how much does that change their look on the playoff? I mean, they need a little bit of help, I think. Do you think they find a way in, and are they a threat once they're in without Tua?
Well, they're certainly a threat, but I think it comes down to, how do they look with him gone? To be honest, after having that type of high ankle injury, I was a little surprised that Tua started. I could see where if he's healthy enough to play, you have him suit up, you have him take warm-ups, and then I think you play the game, and if it shows that you need him, you put him in. Not to say that that's related to his hip injury. I think his hip injury is independent and kind of fluky and is what it is, and might have major ramifications on his career if all these third-party reports are accurate with the nature of it. But, this Alabama team, I think their greatest weakness has actually been on the defensive side. They are not that same level of dominant and disciplined defense that Nick Saban has always been known for. And, he said in the aftermath of the LSU loss that he thought he saw signs of it before the game with how quiet the locker room environment was. It didn't seem to have that same level of focus and poise. And this is a man who knows everything about building a program, about game planning, about directing his team onto a one-week nature, who, when he wins a national championship, he literally is immediately on the phone within 10 minutes working on recruiting for the next season. He's the greatest college football coach of all time. And this is a year where they seem to be a little off. And normally, if you would see a quarterback injury, well, first of all, you would think they'd have Jalen Hurts to turn to, but due to the transfer, you don't have that as a weapon. And I don't think they have that same bedrock of defense to lean on. That said, this is still a mighty talented football team, and it's not often that they've been challenged in this kind of a setting, that they've had to reprove themselves after particularly a divisional loss like that to LSU. And when that last happened in the old BCS days and they got the rematch that I think few nationally really wanted to see, they were able to squeak it out in the low-scoring field goal fest. That won't be the case. They have to score. And is Mac Jones going to be capable of that? Will Tua's brother be capable of that? I think they are going to show themselves, let alone the rest of the country, just exactly what they are with the remaining schedule. And Auburn will provide a very good test in that regard.
Yeah, I was just going to say their final game of the season is at Auburn, and Bama has no margin of error. They cannot lose that game. They lose, they are done. Their chances of the playoff are over. And as you touched on, Mac Jones taking over for Tua after the injury. He's 4 touchdowns to 1 pick this season in when he has played. And then just to wrap up the rest of the top 10, you have Oregon, Utah, Oklahoma, Penn State, and then Florida, who's a 2-loss team. So that pretty much cuts it right there at Penn State, I think, for your chance to get into the playoff. Penn State needs some help. And if they somehow win this week, as we touched on earlier with Ohio State, going on the road, do you see any changes here in the top 10 that you think a team that deserves to be in the top 10, or do you think the committee has done a good job so far with the top 10?
No, I think the committee has done an excellent job. I think the team you can make the best argument for is Oregon, but the Pac-12 nationally has not done enough, and that's where the argument with Clemson and year to year. Are you really looking at each year truly independently, or is there a spillover effect? I think there could and should be, to some extent, a bit of a spillover. And Oregon's a one-loss team. Their one loss came to Auburn on a neutral field to begin the game by less than a touchdown. And then since then, they have offensively been able to put up a ton of points. They haven't been overwhelmingly dominant. It was close with Washington State. It was close with Washington, that are both talented teams. But I don't think the league has totally earned that full level of national respect. I do think there is definitely some geographic bias, that there are many in the country that frankly just don't watch a ton of those games due to the time that they're on, certainly not in their entirety. But that's the team that you can make the best case for. That said, I think the committee has done a great job to this point, and that's why it's always been true, and I think it's become even more true in the era of the CFP. One of the arguments against, at first, the BCS and eventually what's become the college football playoff is it would devalue the regular season. I think the opposite has happened. The regular season always was a playoff in and of itself, and I think it's all the more that right now. I would like to see the CFP expand. I think 8 teams would be a great number to have. I think if you look at the smaller levels of college football, you have equal or more representation level to the amount of teams that participate at those respective levels, and those playoffs work fantastic. But I think the committee has done an excellent job to this point, and the teams will determine it. Win, you stay in, and you lose, you're going to drop, and it's up to those teams below to win and prove themselves to grab that position.
As you did touch on, I think it will figure itself out, and that's usually what it does for the committee at the end with the playoff games. The conference games where you're going to have some of these teams face off. If it all leads to what it's going for, you very well might, have Oregon slide into there, especially if they do not lose. They don't lose out here, and they beat Utah in their conference game. I think you can't put Bama in if Bama doesn't play in their conference game. I think Oregon would have to slide in there, and it would take care of itself. I think Oregon would somehow find a way to be that number 4 team in the playoff, and I do like expanding. I think 6 would be a good number if you don't want to have 8 because you don't know if the 8 are deserving to be in the playoff. Fine. I think 6 would be good. Give the first 2 teams a bye and let it figure itself out after that. But I do like expanding. I think 8, I think a lot of people wouldn't like it, especially when you're hearing a lot of these college football guys talk about it. They don't think some of these teams are deserving to be in the conversation of making the playoff. Where this year you do. You have some teams that do have, some say and could make it into the playoff, where 8 would be interesting to see. But you've had years past where it's like, all right, you have maybe 5 teams that are good, that have a chance to get into the playoff and make some noise and deserving of it. I think 6 would be a good number with a bye for the 1 and 2 seeds.
Yeah, I would point to what the smaller levels of college football do that have had playoffs for an incredibly long span of time, and they have a much higher percentage of their respective population making their playoff, and there have been some fantastic games as a result. Ultimately, do the high seeds wind up advancing? Yeah, but not always, and that's part of why you would have a playoff. And I do think that America would like to see a group of 5 representative in a playoff. And I think the only way that can happen, due to what drives everything in this world, and that's money, the dominant power conferences are going to latch onto as much as possible. The only way you can open that door is you have to make it 8. If you make it 6, there will not be an automatic entry for the best group of 5 team. And if that's the case, then I don't think expansion really carries the juice. Unless you have that potential for a Cinderella moment, that will often not happen. Usually that group of 5 team will be slaughtered, but there's going to be a year at some point where that team will win. And that's, in my mind, what can draw in even the casual fan of college football. I think it raises overall awareness and revenue, and it makes for great drama. And that's the ultimate win in terms of playoff success.
I'm glad you brought that point up because I think that'd be really interesting to see as you hit on, like a Cinderella story kind of thing, a team that's not expected to make some noise here. It kind of feels like Oklahoma a few years ago when they played Bama. It was kind of expected. I think it might have been last year with Kyler Murray. Bama was expected just to roll over him, but Kyler kept them in the mix of that game. I get Bama ended up winning at the end of the game, but I think Kyler kept them in, and that wasn't really expected because Oklahoma doesn't play defense in the Big 12. That's the whole knock of the Big 12. No defense, no defense, no defense. And they actually hung around. So I think having 8, you would allow to see a lot of people, I think, watch it rooting for underdogs, which I think is a great point that you touched on, bringing in not just college football fans, just fans of football in general, just coming in to watch and root for against the Bama or root against the Clemson.
Yeah, I think what makes the NCAA basketball tournament, which is a different animal, it's a different sport, doesn't have the same physical taxation, but what makes it magic is that first weekend and having a 15 challenge at 2. You know, it's something that smart basketball people that watch the teams probably can recognize and anticipate some of these upsets. But some of them even stun the experts. Would football be the same corollary? Not necessarily. But if the greatest gripe is that there are teams that would get in that aren't deserving, well, are you saying not deserving because of resume, or are you saying not deserving because of competitive level? If your thought process is of competitive level, then what's the damage, right? If you're so resolute in your belief that these higher tier teams will wallop them, which I tend to agree with, then there's nothing to lose. Then the higher tier team is going to have an even easier game, and it actually acts as a de facto bye anyway. And could somebody get hurt? Yeah, of course somebody could get hurt. It's football. Like, that's part of what you understand when you sign up to play the sport. I find it ridiculous, the notion of missed class time, because if you look at the missed class time that college basketball players, men's and women's, that straddle 2 or sometimes 3 different semesters or trimesters, depending upon the academic calendar of their respective schools, they miss way more class time over the course of a year than any football player does. And yet that's never brought up, and somehow they seem to do pretty well in class.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do. To wrap up our conversation here, I want to touch on the New York Mets for a little bit, bringing some baseball action here in the offseason. I know you covered the Mets a lot this season on CBS 880, doing play-by-play for the New York Mets. So what do you expect from the Mets this upcoming season? I know they brought in first-time skipper Carlos Beltran. Do you see them letting Wheeler go? What are your expectations for the Mets this offseason? I know they have some key pieces. Pete Alonso winning Rookie of the Year for the National League. McNeil, they have a great staff still. What do you expect from the New York Mets? Do they bring in a Michael Pineda? If they do let Wheeler go, what's your take on the New York Mets?
I think the biggest questions about the Mets and what you're looking for the most is to see the continued growth of Alonso. There are a lot of players historically that will have dominant rookie years, and that sophomore slump will arrive. I don't anticipate that for him. I would actually anticipate the opposite. I think the batting average and the on-base rate will go up. I think more teams will begin to pitch around him, and that will provide ample opportunity for the bats that surround him. I love Michael Conforto. I think there's tremendous room for him to grow. I think in particular because I could see him being right in front or behind where Alonso's going to be. Jeff McNeil, I think, fell way under the radar for a lot of people nationally, and that was shown in a lot of the voting. You can compare his season in many ways to that of DJ LeMahieu, who was right in the thick of the AL MVP race. And LeMahieu had a great year and was dominant with men in scoring position, defensively versatile. But McNeil had a very similar season and was incredibly consistent and was actually a better defender if you look at the advanced defensive metrics at his positions when he was moved around. And I think we'll have a chance to show that all the more. But the questions are going to be, is Jed Lowry healthy? What is he? How does he fit into the mix? Does J.D. Davis continue to play at a high rate? In terms of games, I anticipate his performance to be excellent. But once you infuse Lowry into it, is Davis going to play 5-6 times a week? I think every day is kind of a term that's been antiquated, and he wouldn't necessarily be at one set given position every day. But he was pretty good against lefties and righties. I think the thought when they got him was that he'd be more of a situational platoon bench guy, and he proved to be a lot more than that. And I think was a pretty big presence in that clubhouse. What's going to happen with Edwin Diaz? Was it the different baseballs? Was there something else to him? Who will their pitching coach be? And what will his relationship be like with that entire team, but in particular with Diaz? I think you brought in a pretty established, known commodity in one of the game's elite closers, and he was incredibly vulnerable. He was always accountable. I think he handled himself as well as you possibly could, granted the type of year that he had. What will they do with that other starter spot? I think they have some in-house options in the bullpen that could help. And I think Brody Van Wagenen has spoken about that at a recent time, that if there is a hole in their rotation, that they could shuffle around and maybe go get bullpen help if that's deemed to be more affordable, easier, and ultimately more impactful. But the rest of the coaching staff, how will it look under Beltran? What's Beltran going to be like as a manager? I covered a team in the minors in Wilmington, Delaware, that Beltran played for when he came up in the Royal system, and all the people that dealt with him there as a young kid spoke of his moxie and his cool and his love of and savvy for the game. I think he came across great in his opening presser when he was incredibly emotional and human and connective with the opportunity. I think in today's game, having somebody who's bilingual is a giant asset, particularly on a team that has a lot of really good Latin players. Robbie Cano showed in the second half of the season that he still has some gas left in the tank. I do think his hands, when he got hit on the hands, was part of his struggle in the first half of the season. Ahmed Rosario is a thrilling young star, uber athletic, and improved dramatically defensively during the season. He was a liability the first 6 weeks, and he worked daily, taking extra ground balls and infield work, and raised his game to that of at least an average defender. And with what he can do offensively and what he can do in the run game is a huge weapon. Was a big-time prospect that had never fully blossomed, and I think enjoyed a real launching pad type season. But for the Mets, it's going to be about the consistency of their defense, and exactly how the pitching is oriented and how they perform. You have known commodity with Jacob deGrom and a few other smaller pieces that are part of this team that might be repurposed in some way, and how effective will they be?
Yeah, Ahmed Rosario did have a great season, and as you did touch on, one of his issues was the defensive side of the ball, and he had a great second half after the first few weeks and was a great with the bat, everything. J.D. Davis was great in the outfield for the Mets. And it's just very interesting to see, as you did touch on, with Beltran, what kind of manager is he going to be, being a first-time guy. What's the staff around him going to be like? And just I think Pete Alonso might end up turning into that Aaron Judge role where he starts taking a lot of walks. And as you touched on, the guys behind him, can they drive him in and start pitching around, Pete?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one thing Alonso does that's not nearly as negative as some make it out to be in today's game. He does strike out a pretty good amount, but I think most of the elite, especially power hitters in the game, that's something you live with. When he produces to the level that he does in terms of homers and ribbies and those big moment hits, you can live with the strikeouts. The one thing you wonder is, over a longer span of time, if he's pitched around more and more, does he force things? I think he has tremendous self-criticism and patience. That's a good thing that allows him to grow and work through. But the greatest buffer that's going to help him with that is performance from his teammates. And they're going to have chances to hit. If they deliver, then everything will kind of snowball in a positive way. And of course, over a 162-game season, you're going to see examples of both. But ultimately, what wins out?
Yes, we will see if it snowballs for the polar bear. But, it's going to be a really interesting offseason with the Mets, and just baseball season right around the corner. But, again, really want to thank you for coming on, John.
You got it. Glad to be with you.
Where can people reach you again for the listeners? Where can people find you? I'm going to tag you on Twitter, but where can people find or hear you and reach out to you?
At John Sadak, JohnSadak on Twitter, and John.Sadak on Instagram.
You can follow the Personal Foul Podcast on Twitter at foul_podcast. And you can find the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. But that's a wrap.